Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to show you how to make one of these lovely little lunch bags. It's lined with insulating fleece so it will keep your lunch nice and cool. So let's get started. Cut the following pieces of fabric. You will also need one button and a small piece of hook and loop tape. For the first step you'll need all your pieces of fabric measuring 11 inches by 16 inches. Mark a square 3 inches by 3 inches out of both of the bottom corners. Do exactly the same on the lining and on the reflective fleece. Cut out all of the squares you have just marked. So you should be cutting a square out of the bottom of each of the corners. Take one of the main pieces of fabric with the cut out corners and place it face down, and then place your reflective fabric on top of it with the reflective side, the shiny side, facing up. Then clip in place. I think it's best to use clips for this fabric, but if you haven't got any clips then use pins. Pin the other panel and the reflective fabric together in exactly the same way, with the right side of the fabric facing outwards and the reflective side of the fleece facing outwards. Then sew around the edges of both pieces, so all the way round, taking a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, backtacking at the start and the finish. I'm using my walking foot because the fabric I'm using is quite stretchy, and also the reflective fleece can stretch a bit. Now take the two pieces that we've been working on and place them right sides together, right sides facing, and then clip them together. Then sew together, taking a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. We're only sewing the two sides and the bottom, not the squares that we cut out. And remember to back tack at the start and finish of each section. As my fabric frays quite a lot, I did decide to overlock my seams. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. You can just zigzag on your normal sewing machine. Now we need to box out the corners, so put your hand inside the bag and find one of the openings. What you need to do is match up the side seam and the bottom seam. I'm pushing the side seam to one side and the bottom seam to the other side, so there's not too much bulk in one place, and then I clip in place. And then do exactly the same on the other side. Match up the side and the bottom seam. Make sure you press the side and the bottom seams to opposite directions so there's not too much bulk, and then clip in place. Now sew across both of the corners, taking a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, backtacking at the start and the finish. Rather than overlocking these, I'm going to zigzag. So I'm just altering my stitch. So I'm moving my stitch selector to C for a zigzag, my stitch length to 1 or just under 1, and the width at the top there I'm going to change to 5. Then I'm ready to do a zigzag stitch. With your sewing machine set for a zigzag stitch, sew across both of the corners with your zigzag stitch. So sew across both the ends, and then I trim the seams. Next we repeat exactly the same process with the lining. So with right sides facing, clip your lining or pin your lining together. Then mark an opening of about 3 inches along the bottom edge. I like to centralise mine, but that's not really important. Anywhere along the bottom edge will do. Next, using a straight stitch, sew along the two sides and the bottom edge, taking a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, remembering to leave your opening along the bottom edge. Remembering to back tack at the start and the finish of each of your seams. Next, press open all of your seams. Finger press first and then press with the iron. Take particular care along the bottom edge because you've got the opening there. I'm just leaving these edges raw as they're going to be on the inside of the bag and no one will see them. Next we're going to box out the corners, so put your hand inside the bag, turn it around and line up your bottom seam with your side seam, push the corners out and then clip in place. And then do exactly the same at the other side. Then take over to the sewing machine and sew, taking a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, backtacking at the start and the finish of each seam. Now turn the right side out and give a quick press to the corners you've just boxed out. You should have 3 pieces of fabric left. Take the fabric piece and the lining piece, place one on top of the other and fold in half. Then we need to round the corner off. To do this, I have used a side plate. I think they measure about 6 inches, and I've just drawn round it, and then I cut around the mark I've just made, making a rounded corner. Then cut your reflective fleece to the same size. Then clip your reflective fleece to your outer fabric. with both of the right sides facing outwards. So with the reflective fleece, you want the shiny side, the silvery side, facing upwards. Sew the two pieces together, taking a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. We are going to use hook and loop for the closure, so I've decided to put a decorative button on the front. It's not needed, it's just purely for decoration, so I sew on a button. If you don't want to do this, skip this stage. The next stage is to attach the Velcro to the lining piece, so I'm going to make sure I line it up with where the button is. When you're happy with the position, pin the Velcro into place. Then sew into place all the way around the edges, about a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge on each side, back tacking at the start and the finish. Now pin the bag flap to the lining with right sides facing, so make sure the side you put the Velcro on is facing down towards the right side of the flap. Then clip in place, leaving the top straight edge open. Then sew all around the clipped edges, taking a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Next, trim the seams and then clip around all of the corners. To clip around the corners, cut towards the seam but stop about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam, being very careful not to actually cut into any of your stitching, otherwise your seam will come undone. When your seams are all trimmed and neatened, turn the right side out, pushing the edges out with your fingers. Press with your hot iron, paying particular attention to the edges, rolling the edge of the seam as I go to make sure all of the corners and edges are nice and neat. Then clip all around the side and bottom edges to hold in place, ready for top stitching. So top stitch all around the sides and top, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. We will be sewing down all 4 sides of the bag so that the bag holds its shape better. So first we're going to clip down all of the sides. If you want to, you can measure to make sure you've got the right distance at the top and the bottom. I'm just finger pressing and then clipping in place. Do the same to all 4 sides. Top stitch down all 4 sides, about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. I forgot to film most of this, so I've only got 1 seam, but you do exactly the same to all 4 sides, stopping at the corner. Don't go over the corner, just stop when you get to the corner and back tack. Next, attach the little carry hook. So find the centre of the back panel of your bag and make a mark. Then place the webbing with each side by side and making sure your central mark is in the centre, and then clip in place. Sew in place, taking a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. If you want to, you can go backwards and forwards several times to make sure it is securely held down. Now you can attach the closure flap. So this goes over the top of the little handle we've just put on, with right sides facing right sides. Clip in place, making sure you line the edges up first and the centre of the bag second, and then fill in the gaps with the clips. Before sewing, I always like to just check that I've got everything the right way round, and I have. Now sew the flap on, taking a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. So before attaching the lining, we need to put a piece of Velcro on the bag front for the closure. We've already put one on the flap, so we just need to match the one on the flap to where we're going to put it on the front of the bag. So fold the top over, make a mark where you're going to put the opposite side of the Velcro. So make sure you mark it directly opposite where the Velcro is on the bag flap. Pin the Velcro in place, then take over to the sewing machine and then sew around all 4 sides as close to the edge as you can, back tacking at the start and the finish. Now with your bag the right side out and your lining the wrong side out, place your bag inside the lining, making sure that the flap is tucked down inside too. Make sure you match up your bag sides first with the lining sides and clip in place, and then continue to clip the top of the bag together all the way around the edge. Take over to the sewing machine and sew, taking a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, removing all the clips as you go along. Turn it out the right side out through the hole that we left in the lining. So pull the main bag part out first and then pull the lining out. And then push the lining back inside the bag. Give the bag a good press with a hot iron, especially around the top edge, which we're going to top stitch later. So roll it with your fingers and make sure that none of the lining is showing over the top of the edge of the bag. And when you've got it right, clip in place, ready for our top stitching. At the sewing machine, top stitch all the way around the top edge, 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, remembering to also sew all the way around the top flap. When we get to the little hook that we made, push it forwards so we don't sew it down, and continue to sew all the way around the top of our bag, back tacking at the start and the finish. After trimming off any loose threads, all that we need to do is sew close the opening we left for turning the bag the right side out. Now pull the lining out of the bag and clip it together, ready for sewing. We can either sew on the sewing machine, as I'm going to do now, or if you want to, you can slip stitch it. I do have a video on how to slip stitch, which I'll share in the description below. At the sewing machine, sew the opening closed about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish. And your finished bag should look something like this. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, could you please like and subscribe? See you next time.